So Assistant Editors Bootcamp is a program that myself and another assistant editor named Connor started about 3 years ago. And the idea behind Assistant Editors Bootcamp is that the two of us were assistant editors, and we found when we were getting started that it was really hard to get started in the industry with any kind of experience, because no one was willing to give you that experience that you needed for, let's say, your first job. So when you would go to your interview for that first job, everyone would expect you to have experience, but no one would actually give you the opportunity to have that experience so that you could get that first job. So it was sort of this catch-22. So we started the class so that we could address that. And we started out with just our reality TV class. We expanded into scripted TV classes. Then we did several other classes. And then obviously this year, everything sort of changed with COVID happening. But what we decided to do, since we couldn't hold in-person classes anymore, was we actually decided to make the classes that we've done in the past available on demand. We have 4 classes, actually 5 classes available. They're all on our website. The reality TV class is free. And then the other classes are $50 a piece. So totally reasonable. Let me just do one more quick thing and see if I can get rid of that echo. Sorry, guys. Let me see if I can talk while I'm doing this. So we have 4 classes available, and they're all $50. We have our scripted class, our Premiere class, our effects class, and our audio editing class. And they were all held at different points in time, but they're all very, let's see. Sounds like, yeah, we're still hearing it. What about now? Maybe that fixed it. Okay. No, it didn't. That's all right. Okay, so so why are we doing this class? So this class we are doing, I've done this class before in the past, but I feel like with everything going on right now, everybody working from home and working remotely, it makes more sense than ever to be going over how to work with drives, how to transfer stuff, but not just that, like not just understanding, you know, the difference between USB and Thunderbolt, but also understanding when you would use one versus the other, and when they're going to give you an advantage, and when you're just spending more money. That, and you know, when with all of the stuff out there, all of the different formats, all the different cable types, all of the different ports, it can get really confusing. So I just want to sort of go over that stuff and give you guys a chance to better understand what all of it is. Okay, so the class is 2 hours. At least that's what it's designed to be. And it should take us to about 1 p.m. Last time I said that for our other class, and we went like 3.5 hours. But I'm going to try to slow things down this time, and I'm also going to try to wait until I finish each slide to answer questions. But as I think I said before, if you do have questions, then try to ask them in the Q&A instead of the chat. And lastly, this class will be available on YouTube probably tomorrow for viewing. And if you guys want to watch it again, if you want to send it to friends, that's totally fine. It's a completely free class. And basically there's a lot of people out of work right now. There's a lot of uncertainty about everything, but we want to make sure that you guys can take the opportunity to pick up new skills or to better understand things that you are dealing with in your day-to-day job so that you can make this time as productive as possible. Okay. I really want to figure out where that echo is coming from, but I also, it's my phone. All right, hold on. All right, should be gone now. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on to our slides. All right, so let me switch over. Okay. Let's get started. All right. Let me know, actually, I just closed the chat window. Let me know if there are technical problems, let me know in the Q&A because that's the only window that I have up right now. Otherwise, we'll get started. Everybody can see the, let me bring up the chat window again so that I can make sure that I can see any technical issues, because that's naturally where this stuff comes up. Okay. Sorry for the technical issues, guys. So this is, things have become a lot more complicated since we can't do things in person. I just have to pull up the Q&A, which, there we go. Okay. All right. Okay. All right, so let's get started. So my name is Noah. I started Assist Bootcamp a while ago. I already kind of talked about that. But this presentation is going to be covering understanding I/O and drive speed. And, excuse me, the topics that we're going to cover specifically are cables and transfer speeds, drive speed itself, RAID configurations, shared storage, drive formats, drive mounting, and then there's one or two other things that are in there that aren't mentioned on here, but that's sort of the bulk of what we'll be covering. So before we start talking about any of this stuff, it's really important to understand how speed is measured. So when we're talking about drive speed or transfer speed or anything like that, there are actually two ways to measure, well, to measure speed. So the first one is megabits, and the second one is megabytes. So you can say megabits per second, or you can say megabytes per second. The lowercase b stands for bits, the uppercase b stands for bytes. And the conversion is that there's 8 bits to each byte. So what does this mean? Or actually, when would this be useful? So in general, transfer speeds, like let's say your internet speed or the speed at which something's transferring to a drive, is usually measured in megabits, but file size is usually measured in megabytes. I don't know why, and it's very confusing, but generally that is the case. So the rule of thumb, even though I said that there's 8 bits to each byte because of overhead and other things that you have to consider, the rule of thumb is that speed is measured in megabytes per second, which is effectively 1/10 of megabits per second. So for example, if you have something that's 400 megabits per second, if you convert that to megabytes per second, it's going to be about 40 megabytes per second. So It's also important to understand that when we're talking about megabits and megabytes, because these are such small units of measurement and we're dealing with such large files, actually all these megabits or bits and bytes will always have a prefix, and that prefix will be one of the five that you see here. Usually not so much petabytes. They do exist, and they are dealt with, but we don't see them very often. But usually you'll see kilobytes, megabytes, gigabytes, terabytes, and what those translate to in terms of the number of bytes or bits is kilobytes is 1,000, megabytes is 1,000,000, gigabytes is 1,000,000,000, and terabytes is 1,000,000,000,000. And then petabytes is a quadrillion. A petabyte is quite a bit of space. Okay, so now that you understand how the speed itself is measured, it's helpful to take a look at sort of the history of file transfer. So when we're talking about file transfers, especially file transfers that are relevant for today, when we're talking about connectors, the best place to start would probably be with FireWire. So FireWire had two versions. The original version, which came out in 1995, was called FireWire 400. The technical name is IEEE 1394A, but nobody really uses that name. And the transfer rate for FireWire 400 was 400 megabits per second, which was effectively about 40 megabytes per second. After FireWire, we had USB 1, which no one really used for drives because it was just far too slow. And then we had USB 2 in 2000. So USB 2.0 has a transfer rate of 480 megabits per second, which is effectively about 48 megabytes per second. And you'll notice that USB 2 had a bunch of different connectors. And you'll notice that some of them are called B and some of them are called A, and then one of them is called C. And the idea behind that is that with USB, the idea behind a type A connector was that the type A connector would always connect to the host. So normally that would be like the computer. And then the type B connector would connect to the device. So let's say that you're plugging in a printer. The type A port would be on the computer and the type B port would be on the printer. Or a phone, the type B port would be on the phone. With USB-C, which is a new type of USB connector and cable that was introduced a few years ago, the idea behind it is that instead of using two different ports for the computer and the device, you use the same port on both. So with a Type-C cable, you will have a Type-C port at one end and a Type-C port at the other end. So the computer and the device would both have Type-C. So that's USB 2. Then in 2002, we got FireWire 800. And FireWire 800 has a different connector from FireWire 400, and its transfer rate is 800 megabits per second, which is about 80 megabytes per second. Next, we had eSATA. Now, in the world of Mac computers, Apple computers, eSATA was not really much of a player. It never shipped on any Macs, but it was pretty popular in Windows environments. And eSATA had a transfer rate of between 1.5 and 6 gigabits per second. So that's a jump. We just went from megabits to gigabits, which is effectively about 150 to 600 megabytes per second. Next, we have USB 3. USB 3 came out in 2010, and it's pretty widely used today. Visually, USB 3 looks really similar to USB 2, but you'll notice that there are some differences. One of them is that, in general, USB 3 ports and cables use blue connectors instead of gray or white like USB 2. And also, you'll notice that the Type B connectors are a little different. And actually, not too many people know this, but they are actually backwards compatible with the type C connectors. So for example, if you look at the micro B connector here, you'll notice that the right part of the connector, I guess you could say, is actually exactly the same as the micro B connector from USB 2.0. So if you have a USB 2.0 cable, you could actually plug that into a USB 3 drive with a micro B port. And the same is true of the full-size type B. So for example, if you have a drive with this connector, you could actually plug in this cable, but you will get slower speeds because the cable itself cannot carry the full USB 3 connection. And USB 3 has a transfer rate of 5 gigabits per second, which is effectively about 500 megabytes per second. So next we have Thunderbolt. And Thunderbolt actually starts a little bit before its introduction. So Thunderbolt 1 was introduced in 2011, but there is some confusion that resulted in, or that came from how Thunderbolt was developed, I guess you could say. So Thunderbolt actually uses a connector that was used before Thunderbolt even existed. So in probably like 2008, I think, Apple introduced a connector for video called a mini DisplayPort connector, which you can see here. And the mini DisplayPort connector was shipped on all of the Macs at the time. And basically all it did was it gave you a video signal. So you would plug in a mini DisplayPort cable to, let's say, your HDMI TV, and it would give you video. In 2011, when Apple decided to, or Apple and Intel actually, decided to introduce Thunderbolt, instead of creating a brand new connector, what they actually did was they repurposed, in mini DisplayPort uses this icon. So if you have a laptop, it'd have to be like 2008 to 2010. If it has this icon, that means that it has mini DisplayPort, not Thunderbolt. So when Apple introduced Thunderbolt, they reused the same mini DisplayPort connector, but instead of using that icon, they used this icon. So Thunderbolt technically uses a mini DisplayPort connector, but carries much more than just mini DisplayPort or DisplayPort. Mini DisplayPort is the connector. DisplayPort is a protocol, which a protocol means a way of sending information. So Thunderbolt 1 has a transfer rate of 10 gigabits per second, or 1 gigabyte per second max. And Thunderbolt 2, which was introduced in 2013, has a transfer rate of 20 gigabits per second, or 2 gigabytes per second max. So it basically doubled. So next we have one that not too many people are even aware of exists, and that's called USB 3.1 Gen 2. So in 2013, and the story gets weirder, but basically the USB Implementers Forum decided that they wanted to make a faster version of USB 3. So they called it USB 3.1, but instead of just calling it the faster version USB 3.1, they decided to retroactively rename USB 3.0 to USB 3.1 Gen 1 and call this new version that's faster USB 3.1 Gen 2. Now that's confusing, but it got even more confusing because they introduced another version after that called USB 3.2, and once again, retroactively renamed USB 3.1 Gen 1 and USB 3.1 Gen 2 to USB 3.2. So you will either see, sorry, let me move something. You will either see USB 3.0 when you're talking about the 5 gigabits per second transfer on a new product. You will probably see USB, it will probably say USB 3.2 Gen 1, which is really confusing because it's basically just USB 3.0. But they've been retroactively renamed for no particularly good reason. And then when you're talking about 10 gigabit per second USB, that would be either USB 3.1 Gen 1, or sorry, Gen 2, or USB 3.2 Gen 2. And I know this is very confusing. And if you want to read some articles about it, I'm happy to forward them to you. And it actually gets even more confusing when you learn about USB 4, which is coming next year. But I decided to leave that out of the presentation because no one's really dealing with it yet. And it also gets more complicated because there's actually technically a faster version of USB 3.2, but it's all very confusing. I understand it, but it's still, there's still some things about it that really confuse me. All right, so next we have one that was introduced right around the same time as USB 3.1 and 3.2, or actually 3.1, which is Thunderbolt 3. So Thunderbolt 3 was introduced in 2015, and the idea behind Thunderbolt 3 was that instead of using, actually, I'm going to cover this later. So for now, I'm just going to say Thunderbolt 3 actually uses a Type-C connector, which is the same as USB, but it has a transfer rate of 40 gigabits per second, or 4 gigabytes per second max. And then as far as network connections, we have two of them. We have Ethernet, which in its current form came out in 1999. And Ethernet over copper has a transfer rate of between 1 and 10 gigabits per second, which is effectively about 100 to up to 1,000 megabytes per second. And lastly, we have fiber. And fiber, which actually came out before Ethernet, but has many versions, has a transfer rate between 4 and 32 gigabits per second, which is effectively 400 to 3,200 or 3.2 gigabits per second. Does anybody have any questions before I move on from this slide? I know it's a lot of information and it's potentially very confusing. All right, I'm gonna keep moving on. If you guys have questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A and I will try to answer them at some point. But let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. All right, so we just talked about cables. Let's talk a little bit about ports and something that you may never have heard of called buses. So a port is the physical connector on a device. So for example, if we look at the back of the previous generation Mac Pro, you'll see that it has 4 USB ports, 6 Thunderbolt ports, and 2 Ethernet ports. And then at the bottom, it's got a little HDMI. So those are the ports on the system. But when we're talking about transfer speeds, ports are not the only thing that we have to take into consideration. There's one other thing that we have to think about, and that's what's called the bus. So when we're talking about a computer, everything is controlled by computer chips. And with transfer protocols like USB, all of the transfer negotiating, so to speak, is controlled by computer chips. So the bus is actually the computer chip that controls the connection. So if we look at what that looks like on the Mac Pro, you'll see that even though the Mac Pro, if we look at the Thunderbolt ports, even though the Mac Pro has 6 Thunderbolt ports, it only has 3 Thunderbolt buses. So you'll see it has Thunderbolt bus 1, which is ports 1 and 3. It has Thunderbolt bus 2, which is ports 2 and 4, and then it has Thunderbolt bus 0, which is ports 5 and 6. So even though each of these, and the bus itself can only provide full bandwidth to a single port. So that means that even though technically each Thunderbolt 2 port on the back of the Mac Pro is capable of providing up to 20 gigabits per second, which is the bandwidth of Thunderbolt 2, since multiple ports are controlled by the same bus, and the bus is limited to that full bandwidth as well, that means that if, let's say, for example, if you plug in 2 devices to ports 1 and 3, since they're on the same bus, they're actually going to be sharing that 20 gigabit per second transfer rate, because the bus can only provide that full transfer rate to, or it has to split that between the ports that it has. So because of that, the speed of a port is actually determined by the number of other ports in use on the same bus. So if you have, let's say you have 4 USB ports like you have on the back of the Mac Pro, and they're all USB 3, so they're technically capable of 5 gigabits per second. If they're all on the same bus, and that bus is also capable of 5 gigabits per second, that means that if you have 2 drives transferring between each other via USB 3, they're actually sharing that bandwidth, because you have each one using half of the bandwidth. Whereas, let's say if you plug in a USB drive and then you plug in a Thunderbolt drive, then each of those can use its full bandwidth. Hopefully that makes sense to everybody. If you guys have any questions about it, go ahead and answer or ask them in the Q&A. There is a question, which is there a reason why they don't provide 1 bus per port to maximize speed? Yes, the answer is cost. It would cost too much, and most people wouldn't need it. With really high-end systems, I actually don't know this for sure, but I would imagine that the higher end you get, the more, actually no, I do know this for sure, the more buses you get per port. So for example, the lower end MacBook Pro has 2 Thunderbolt 3 ports that share a bus, whereas the higher end MacBook Pro has 4 Thunderbolt 3 ports with 2 buses. So you have you're capable of more speed overall on that computer. And the second question is, how do you distinguish which bus is where? It's really hard to find this out. It's much easier with well-documented models that are very popular, like the Mac Pro. If you get a random computer, like a random PC, or even a lower-end Mac, you'll have to dig really deep to be able to find out how many buses there are on the system and what ports are controlled by them. And then last question is there a reason most Windows machines don't use Thunderbolt? Let me come back to that one. George, if you could ask that again when I get to Thunderbolt in just a minute, that would be great, just because I'm going to be talking a lot more about Thunderbolt, and what I talk about might answer your question. So I'm going to say, actually, no, just go ahead and ask the question again once we get there, which is actually right now, but wait until I get to the end of it. Okay, so now we're going to talk about Thunderbolt. So Thunderbolt is a connection that's pretty widely used in post-production, and it was developed by Apple and Intel, and it was first released in 2011. So Thunderbolt is a little different from any other connection or format protocol that came before it, because it actually contains multiple types of protocols within a single cable. So for example, with USB, you have only one protocol within that cable, and that's data transfer. Or with HDMI, you have only one transfer protocol, which is video. So the idea behind Thunderbolt was that they wanted to wrap as many protocols as possible into one connection. But not only that, they wanted to include a protocol that had never really been included in any connection before. So Thunderbolt incorporates something called PCI Express, which I'm going to shorten to PCIe, as well as DisplayPort over a single cable. So what exactly is PCI Express? PCI Express is actually the bus, and remember before I said the bus is the connection, basically. It's the chip that talks to the, or that negotiates the connection. PCI Express is the bus that is actually inside the computer. So for example, if we look at this HP, you'll see that it's got a graphics card in it. And you'll notice that there are some slots above the graphics card and below the graphics card. And then there are like, there are, I guess you'd also call them slots, the like black lines next to, I'm not sure how to describe it, but basically these are called PCI slots. And PCI slots are where how you expand a computer. So for example, if you wanted to add a graphics card, if you wanted to add a faster network connection, you would add a network card. If you wanted to add higher quality sound, you would add a sound card. And all of that is done through PCI slots in the normal world. And the way that PCI slots work is that they use PCI Express. So they connect to the motherboard of the computer, which uses the PCI Express protocol. So the idea behind Thunderbolt is that with Thunderbolt, going back, PCI Express or PCIe acts as an extension of the motherboard. So you're able to connect things to the computer that would otherwise be located on the motherboard through that PCI Express connection. So, and that allows for high data transfer speed. Sorry, let me go back. So normally PCI Express would be within the computer. The idea behind Thunderbolt is that it actually takes PCI Express and brings it outside of the computer. So you can plug in one of these cards through Thunderbolt and get the same kind of speed that you would be able to get if you actually place the card inside the computer. And because of that, Thunderbolt allows for high-speed data transfer, but it also allows you to add external components that would otherwise have to be inside the computer. So for example, you can, with Thunderbolt, add a hub, and that hub can contain components that would otherwise have to be in the computer. So for example, you can have a bunch of USB ports, you can have display connections, you can have more Thunderbolt ports, you can have a FireWire port, you can have an Ethernet port, all over that one cable. And the reason for that is that you have that direct connection to the motherboard through PCI Express. Technically, you could do some of this through USB, but it would be far less efficient. The other thing that you can do with Thunderbolt is, actually, I sort of mentioned this, with Thunderbolt, you can actually take the cards that you would normally put inside of the computer, and you can have them outside of the computer connected via a Thunderbolt cable. And you do that with something like a Thunderbolt expansion chassis. So this right here is a Thunderbolt expansion chassis. So you can actually take cards that would otherwise have to go inside the computer, and you can connect those via a Thunderbolt cable to the computer and have it act just as if those cards were connected directly to the motherboard. Along with that, you can also have external graphics cards. So for example, here we have a Thunderbolt eGPU that allows us to plug in a graphics card that would otherwise have to be directly connected to the motherboard. Now, there are some bottlenecks here. Graphics cards have higher transfer speeds than Thunderbolt is capable of producing, but you can get about 70 to 80% of the bandwidth from the graphics card through that Thunderbolt 3 cable. So let's talk a little bit about Thunderbolt 3. So this is Thunderbolt overall, but let's get specifically into Thunderbolt 3. So Thunderbolt 3 is a little different from Thunderbolt 1 and 2 because I mentioned Thunderbolt 1 and 2 incorporate PCI Express and DisplayPort over a single cable. But when Thunderbolt 3 was introduced, instead of using the, I know this term is confusing, but I sort of explained it before, the mini DisplayPort plug that Thunderbolt 1 and 2 uses, they decided to use a USB-C cable. And USB-C is something that was developed, I think around 2013, 2014. And the idea behind USB-C is that it's a brand new cable that not only allows you to plug in the same port at both ends, but it also includes more than just data transfer within the cable wiring by default. So the USB-C cable spec includes not only USB, but it also includes DisplayPort, which means it can carry video, and it includes enough power to charge a laptop all over a single cable. So whereas with USB A and B, all you could ever do with those cables, natively at least, is transfer data. With a USB-C cable, the cable itself includes all of the circuitry to carry not only USB, but DisplayPort, which is a video connection, and enough power for a laptop. So the USB cable spec came out in like 2014, I think. So with Thunderbolt 3, what they decided to do was actually take Thunderbolt and add it to USB-C. So with Thunderbolt 3, what it actually does is it adds PCI Express to USB-C. And therefore, it inherits USB DisplayPort and power from the USB-C cable that it's running over. I know that's confusing. I think that I've laid it out in a way that makes pretty good sense. But let me know if anybody's still confused about that. But basically, you have these three different formats. You have Thunderbolt 1 and 2, USB-C, and then, well, USB-C is actually a port, but Thunderbolt 3 is basically built on top of USB-C, but USB-C already includes the USB protocol, the DisplayPort protocol, and power. So all Thunderbolt 3 does is it adds PCI Express to that cable. And there was a question earlier, going back and answering, I think it was George's question, why is Thunderbolt not more popular on Windows? The main reason that Thunderbolt isn't more popular on Windows, or it wasn't more popular on Windows until recently, was licensing. When Thunderbolt first came out, well, first of all, when Thunderbolt first came out, Intel was barely licensing it to anyone. Over time, they loosened those restrictions. And in addition to that, it wasn't actually, the circuitry for Thunderbolt wasn't actually built into any of Intel's chips. So in order to have Thunderbolt on a computer, you had to have a separate dedicated chip that manufacturers would have to pay for. So it was kind of a giant pain in the ass when Thunderbolt first came out to implement it. Apple did it because they developed it with Intel and they wanted it to be successful, but third parties really didn't have much incentive to use it. Now, over time, that's changed because Intel has incorporated all of the components necessary for Thunderbolt into their processors, which all of these computers use anyway. And in addition to that, with Thunderbolt 3, Intel made it so that you no longer have to pay any royalty fees in order to add Thunderbolt to a device or in order to add Thunderbolt to a computer. So you'll notice that a lot of, well, not a lot, but a much higher number of Windows PCs now have Thunderbolt 3 than ever did before. And the reason for that is that it's much more accessible and the price for manufacturers to implement it is much, much lower than it used to be. George, I hope that answers your question. If you have any follow-ups, just drop them in the Q&A. All right, so I mentioned Thunderbolt 3, I mentioned USB, so let's talk about the capabilities of these. So all of these cables do different things. Some do more than others. So for example, if we look at a USB A or B cable, it only does one thing, which is that it does data transfer over USB. So it doesn't have DisplayPort, it doesn't have PCI Express, it cannot power a laptop, but it does have well, technically 3, but 2 transfer speeds that we care about, USB 2 and USB 3. Next, we have a mini DisplayPort cable, and this is the cable or the port that I was talking about that was on earlier Mac laptops. It looks the same as a Thunderbolt port, except it has a different logo on it. And with DisplayPort, you can only carry one signal, which is a video signal. So it has DisplayPort, but it doesn't have anything else. And it doesn't do any data transfer. So all it can do is display picture. Next, we have Thunderbolt 1 and 2. So with Thunderbolt 1 and 2, there was no USB, and there wasn't enough power for a laptop. So you could carry a DisplayPort signal and you could carry a PCI Express signal. And the data transfer, instead of being done over USB on Thunderbolt 1 and 2, was actually done through the PCI Express connection. And you had 2 transfer speeds. With Thunderbolt 1, that was 10 gigabits per second. With Thunderbolt 2, it was 20. Next, we have the USB-C cable. So in the USB-C cable spec, it allows for a USB connection. It also allows for a DisplayPort connection and enough power for a laptop. And it can transfer at any of the 3 USB speeds that we talked about before. And then lastly, we have Thunderbolt 3. So Thunderbolt 3 uses that USB-C cable, but it adds PCI Express and therefore through that PCI Express connection, adds a faster transfer speed, which is what's considered the Thunderbolt 3 transfer speed, or Thunderbolt, the 40 gigabits per second that Thunderbolt 3 gets. So there's a question, Thunderbolt 2 can also carry power. Yes, it can, but it's a minuscule amount of power. It's enough for an external portable drive. That's probably about it. So what's the difference between USB-C and Thunderbolt 3 in terms of power? I believe Thunderbolt 3 has a slightly higher ceiling. It can charge a little more, but the thing that's confusing about all of this is very confusing, but it gets even more confusing because USB-C, since it's a completely open spec, can be implemented in whatever way the manufacturer wants. So USB-C can carry all of these things, or it can carry only one of them. The manufacturer can do whatever they want. So for example, if you bought a recent MacBook Pro, you'll notice that your computer comes with a USB-C cable, and it powers your laptop, but it doesn't have DisplayPort, and its USB connection speed is only USB 2. And that's because Apple didn't want to spend the money to add any other functionality to it besides the ability to charge your laptop. So lower end cables usually have less capability, but the cable can do any or all of these things. And basically Thunderbolt 3 is just another capability of USB-C, but it has its own branding. I know that's all really confusing, and again, please feel free to ask more questions, but I'm going to continue on and talk a little bit about backward compatibility. So when we're talking about Thunderbolt 3 cables and ports can carry USB signals. So if you were to plug in a USB-C cable to the Thunderbolt 3 port on your MacBook Pro, it can carry that USB connection. Or if you were to take the Thunderbolt 3 cable that you have, or take a Thunderbolt 3 cable, because you might not have one, and plug it into your computer that doesn't have Thunderbolt 3, the cable is actually smart enough to downgrade itself to whatever your computer has, and will actually only carry the signals that your computer is able to carry. So for example, if you have an Android phone that charges over USB-C and you have a Thunderbolt 3 cable, you can actually plug in the Thunderbolt 3 cable to your phone and it will actually charge it, which is pretty cool. Or you can do that if you have a Mac laptop, you can use a Thunderbolt 3 cable to charge it. USB cables and ports cannot carry Thunderbolt, and that's a general rule. And that's USB-C and USB-A and B. I feel like this is all really confusing and I'm not getting that many questions, which concerns me a little bit. So please, if you have questions or you need to clarify something, let me know. Or if this is all making sense, let me know that too. I just want to make sure that people aren't like just tuning out because it's too confusing. So, okay, great. All right, so so the question is, can Thunderbolt ports handle regular USB 3? So that's sort of as with everything, that's sort of a complicated question. So with Thunderbolt 3, because it's built on USB-C, which natively carries USB, the Thunderbolt 3 cable can natively carry a USB-C, or sorry, a USB 3 connection. But with Thunderbolt 1 and 2, there is no native USB capability. So with Thunderbolt 1 and 2, it technically natively can't carry USB, but if you have a chip that converts Thunderbolt to USB 3, you can actually have, let's say, a Thunderbolt 2 dock that has Thunderbolt 3 ports on it. But it's not as efficient because there's a translation there going on because Thunderbolt 1 and 2 don't natively speak USB. So I'm going to consider that one answered. Do USB-A and B use a different bus from USB-C and Thunderbolt 3? Yeah, so USB-A and B, well, yes and no. I believe the bus with USB-C is different from USB-A and B, but the protocol would be the same. So the bus is actually it's actually the chip that is talking, that is doing the negotiating, and I believe that would have to be different. I don't know things at the engineering level, so it's hard for me to say, but I believe that would have to be different with USB-C than it would be with USB-A and B. But don't quote me on that one. You'd have to do a little more research about that. All right, and then the last one is, does a Thunderbolt connector fit into a USB 3 port? No, it does not. Technically, so if we're talking about a Thunderbolt 1 or 2 connector, no, it does not fit into a USB 3A port. And I know that's a lot of qualifiers. But if we go another way, technically a Thunderbolt 3 connector will fit into a USB-C port that connects at USB 3 speeds, because USB 3 is actually the transfer speed. It's not the connector. The connector is always USB-A, USB-B, or USB-C. USB 3, 3.1, USB 3.2, those are actually the transfer speed of the connection. All right, so I am going to go ahead and move on to backward compatibility. So I think this section, if you don't get anything else out of this, well, this probably isn't the most useful, but it's in day-to-day things that you may come across, this is probably the best way to lay out how all this stuff works. So I've sort of gathered together recent Mac computers. The whole presentation is very Mac-centric, and I apologize if you live somewhere where Macs are not used or are rare, but I live in Los Angeles, where post-production is basically exclusively Macs. And when we're talking about Thunderbolt, Macs are very popular. So when we're talking about backward compatibility, first we'll talk about the USB 3 protocol. So if we look at a current MacBook Pro, this is, I think this is a 13-inch, could be a 15-inch. So the current MacBook Pros have Thunderbolt 3 ports. So let's say that you have a drive that doesn't have Thunderbolt 3. So how do you connect this drive to this computer? Because there isn't actually a native connection on here, right? We don't have a Thunderbolt 3 port on this drive. But what we do have is we have Thunderbolt, probably Thunderbolt 1, and USB 3. So what we could do is we have two different options. The first one is we could use a Thunderbolt 1 to 2, or sorry, 1 or 2 to Thunderbolt 3 adapter, along with a Thunderbolt 1 or 2 cable. So the adapter would plug into the laptop, the cable would plug into the drive, and that would give us a connection. Or we could use a USB 3 cable. One end would plug into the drive, and then we would use on the other end a USB-C adapter. So that would plug into the A side of the cable, and then the USB-C would plug into the laptop, and that would give us a connection. Or alternatively, we could skip the adapter on that one, and we could use a USB-C to USB-B cable. So even though it looks like these two can't connect to one another, with the right connector or right adapter, you can get the exact same connection that you would get if the laptop had natively like the cable that you were expecting. So what about if you had FireWire? So you're looking at quite a few adapters here, but it's definitely still possible. So you would use a Thunderbolt 1 or 2 to 3 adapter. You would then use a Thunderbolt to FireWire adapter. And then if you plug into the FireWire 800 port on the drive, you would use a FireWire 800 cable. Or if you want to plug into the FireWire 400 port on the drive, you would use a FireWire 800 to 400 cable. So then one side would plug into the drive, the other side would plug into the adapter, which would plug into the other adapter, which would plug into the laptop. Pretty crazy, but it would work. There was a question, are there drawbacks to using an adapter? Do you lose any speed? No. There's no connection difference between connecting through adapters, at least with this configuration. There's no connection difference between plugging through adapters and plugging directly from the FireWire port on the drive to a FireWire port on a computer. So That's with recent Thunderbolt 3 Max. What about if we have an older machine, one that doesn't have Thunderbolt 3? What do we do? So if we look at the MacBook Pro that was produced from 2012 to 2015, you'll notice that we have a bunch of ports on the side here, but none of them is Thunderbolt 3. So what do we do if we get a Thunderbolt 3 drive? So what we would do here is we would use a Thunderbolt 1 or 2 to 3 adapter and a Thunderbolt 1 or 2 cable. And we would just plug in the Thunderbolt 3, the USB-C end of the Thunderbolt adapter would plug into the drive, and then the Thunderbolt cable would plug into the laptop. And you would get Thunderbolt 1 or 2 speeds, because technically, since the drive is, or at least the connection on the drive is faster than the connection on the laptop, you are getting a downgrade there, but it's because the laptop isn't capable of the connection that the drive is capable of. Alternatively, you could use, actually, this one's a little surprising, but you'll notice if you look at the back of the drive, you have 2 Thunderbolt ports, then you have an HDMI port, which you'll be like, why does a drive have an HDMI port? The reason that the drive has the HDMI port is because Thunderbolt can actually carry video. So you could actually plug in a Thunderbolt cable to this drive and then plug a monitor into it, and it would actually work, which is pretty cool. But right next to the HDMI port, you'll see a little USB-C port with a USB logo underneath it. That is actually a USB port. So if you have a computer that doesn't have Thunderbolt at all, you could actually plug into it by using a USB-C to USB-A cable. I know, this is all really weird and confusing, but hopefully it's making sense. So what about if you have, let's say, an old Mac tower? So these towers are very old at this point. The last time they were produced was about 8 years ago. And believe it or not, these towers, which are still, I think, fairly widely used in parts of the industry, if you were to try to plug into, so there's a question about why does it have an HDMI port on this drive? So the reason it has the HDMI port is basically that Thunderbolt carries a video signal. So when you plug your computer, as long as you're using actually any type of Thunderbolt, when you plug it into your computer, it can carry any signal that Thunderbolt is capable of carrying. And since Thunderbolt can carry DisplayPort, which is a video signal, the drive itself can actually pull that video signal over to the HDMI connector, so that when you plug in an HDMI cable to the drive, it's actually grabbing the DisplayPort signal off of the Thunderbolt connection and using that, which is pretty crazy. But yes, since Thunderbolt has that display connection on it, the drive is tapping into that. So when we're talking about an older Mac Pro, if we, let's say we receive this drive and we have this computer, believe it or not, or actually with this computer as well, the 2012 and earlier Mac Pros don't have Thunderbolt or USB 3, which means that the only connection that a stock Mac Pro could use to connect to either of these drives is USB 2, which is pretty crazy. So technically you could put a card in the back of the Mac Pro to get USB 3 speeds, not Thunderbolt. But just keep that in mind. And another thing to note is that if you look closely at the back of this Mac Pro, you'll see ports that look like Thunderbolt right on at the bottom of the where the PCI cards are. That's not Thunderbolt. that's actually mini DisplayPort. So if you were to plug a Thunderbolt drive into those ports, it would do nothing because they're completely different protocols. They just have the same connector. I mentioned before that mini DisplayPort was introduced in like 2008, and then Apple reused the connector for Thunderbolt, which can be a little confusing. Okay, does anybody have any questions before I move on? Okay, all right, so let's talk a little bit about drives. So when we're talking about hard drives and flash drives / SSDs, there are basically 4 types of drives as far as speed goes that you'll run into. The first one is portable hard drives. Portable hard drives are slower than desktop hard drives. And so in general, they range from about 40 megabytes per second up to probably about 150 megabytes per second for a single drive. And that depends on the RPM, which is the speed at which the drive rotates, or the disks in the drive rotate, and the manufacturer of the drive. With a desktop hard drive, that ranges from about 60 megabytes per second for the cheaper drives, which have slower RPMs, to up to about 250 megabytes per second for a single drive, again, depending on RPM and manufacturer. And when you're talking about hard drives, that's about as fast as you're going to get, unless you're talking about RAID, which we'll get into in a little while. But if you're talking about a single drive, with a hard drive, you can't get any faster than 250 megabytes per second. So what you have to do is you have to move up to an SSD. An SSD doesn't have any moving components, and therefore can get much faster transfer speeds. So with a SATA SSD, which usually looks kind of like a portable hard drive, but is actually different, you can get a transfer rate between 1.5 and 6 gigabits per second, which is effectively about 150 to 600 megabytes per second. And that number is actually, unlike hard drives, that number is usually pretty reliably rated by the manufacturer. So when you buy an SSD, usually it will tell you its speed, its speed writing and reading. And usually those are slightly different. The ones that I'm quoting are usually the read speed, which is usually faster than the write speed. And then lastly, we have PCIe SSDs. So I mentioned the protocol PCI Express before. So in the world of hard drives generally used a different protocol from other cards because they were too slow to actually use all of the speed that the computer was capable of producing. But since we've moved away from hard drives and onto SSDs, you can actually use that same PCI Express connection that would be used for other cards, but with storage. So with PCI Express SSDs, you can get crazy transfer rates. So you can get transfer rates between 10 and 50 gigabits per second, which is effectively between 1 and 5 gigabytes per second. Crazy fast. And that is usually rated by the manufacturer as well. All right, so next let's talk about daisy chaining. So daisy chaining is the process of, or the concept of connecting one drive to another. And FireWire and Thunderbolt can be daisy chained. So if you look at an old FireWire 400 drive, you'll notice that it has 2 ports on it. Those ports are for daisy chaining. The same is true of FireWire 800. The same is true of Thunderbolt 1 and 2, and the same is true of Thunderbolt 3. So with all of these, you can actually daisy chain connections. Let's say that you have 3 hard drives. You could actually plug in the hard drives to one another, and you will get a connection to all 3 of them just by using one cable into your computer. But there is a compromise, which is that the throughput of your daisy chain is equal to the bandwidth of a single cable. So for example, If you have, let's say, 3 drives, and each one is capable of 10 gigabits per second, if you're using if they're all connected to each other over Thunderbolt, and you're using a single Thunderbolt cable into your computer, the single Thunderbolt cable is also only capable of 10 gigabits per second. And because of that, this is also hard to explain, but since you've got 3 drives, each capable of 10 gigabits per second, but you've only got 1 cable going into your computer, and that cable is only capable of 10 gigabits per second, you have an aggregate between the 3 drives of about 30 gigabits per second, but you're actually limited by the single cable into your computer to just 10 gigabits per second. So therefore, the throughput is only, or sorry, the throughput of all of the drives when connected to your computer through a daisy chain is equal to the bandwidth of the cable that's connecting to the computer. I know that's a little confusing, but if you have follow-up questions, feel free to ask. And with daisy chaining, you can connect up to 6 devices. And in the world of FireWire, that's only hard drives. In the world of Thunderbolt, that's anything that connects over Thunderbolt. So you could actually have, I believe it has to be at the end of a chain, but you could actually have a display as part of your daisy chain with Thunderbolt. Now, another thing to note with daisy chaining is that power is lost with each bus-powered device. So for example, if you daisy chain multiple portable hard drives, each one is using the power from a single cable. So you're actually, after about 2 drives, you're gonna be maxed out because you no longer have enough power. These drives are powered over that FireWire cable, and and the power has to come from the computer. And since they're all sharing that one cable, there's not enough power to turn all of those drives on. So keep in mind that if you're using a daisy chain and the drives are powered over the cable that is being daisy chained, you're gonna have a limit on the number of drives that you can plug in. All right, so we have a couple questions. I'm gonna try to answer those quickly. Is it possible to use a Thunderbolt 3 connection to a PCIe expansion chassis to add in more NVMe SSD cards? More motherboards seem to be limited to 2 NVMe SSDs. Absolutely. There are a lot of options out there. There are also mSATA options. But yeah, you can definitely add more NVMe. NVMe is basically another name for PCI Express drives. So yeah, you can add a lot of them because each Thunderbolt port, or at least each one on a different bus, can be connected to either an expansion chassis with cards in it that have SSDs, or there are some other options that I can show you guys later if you're interested. And then moving on to the next one, what is the pro or advantage of daisy chaining? The advantage of daisy chaining is if you are limited in the number of ports on your computer, basically. So for example, if you have a computer that only has 2 Thunderbolt 3 ports, but you have 4 drives that need to be connected to the computer, you could actually daisy chain 2 of those drives to each other, 2 of those drives to each other, and then you could connect all 4 drives at the same time. And that answers the next question, which is why would you daisy chain? And the last one is the goal of daisy chaining to get more drives connected while using fewer connectors? Yes, absolutely. So that's basically the only advantage to it, is that it allows you to connect more things to the machine with fewer ports. And if, as I'll talk about later, if you're using something, or if you're plugging in some drives that don't use the full bandwidth of the cable, then there's no disadvantage to daisy chaining, because basically, if the drives are slow and the cable connection is fast, then the speeds of the drives together will not be enough to saturate even that single cable. I know this is all very confusing, but hopefully that made sense. All right, so next we're going to talk about RAID. So a RAID, the idea behind a RAID is taking multiple hard drives or SSDs and connecting them together in a way that allows you to gain either speed or redundancy. And I'll explain what actually redundancy is. Basically the ability to have backups of something. So with a RAID configuration, there are multiple configurations of RAID, which I'm going to talk about, and each of those configurations balances either the speed of the drive or the amount of redundancy that that configuration has. So the first one is if you have no RAID. So for example, if you take 3 hard drives, let's say that they're all 500 gigabytes apiece. If you then if you were to plug that into your computer, it would see them as 3 separate drives. So on Windows, you would get the D drive, the E drive, and the F drive, and they would all have a capacity of 500 gigabytes per second. So it'd be as if you were plugging in 3 separate drives. That's with no RAID. The first type of RAID that we're going to talk about is called RAID 0, or a striped RAID. And RAID 0 is most commonly used for speed. And the idea behind RAID 0 is that it takes all 3 disks and it makes them into a single disk. So if you have 3 500 gigabyte drives, you would then have 1.5 terabytes of space. And the computer would see it as only 1 drive. And the advantage to RAID 0 is that the speed is equal to the throughput of 1 disk multiplied by the number of disks. So if a single disk is only, let's say, 150 megabytes per second, if you that's if you have no RAID. If you make a RAID 0 and you have 3 drives, you would then have 150 megabytes per second times 3. So instead of, with 3 slow drives, you would get a fairly fast RAID because their speeds add up. And the capacity is equal to the capacity of all disks combined. So if you have 3 times 500 gigabytes, that's 1.5 terabytes. However, there is no redundancy. So that means that if any of those disks fails, then your entire RAID is gone. You have nothing left, basically. So you get speed, but you get no redundancy. The next type of RAID that's common is called RAID 1. And the idea behind RAID 1 is that you have drives mirroring one another. With RAID 1, speed is slightly faster than the throughput of a single drive. So you would have 3 disks at 500 gigabytes. And the data is written identically to 2 or more drives. And you have full redundancy. But it's definitely, as I said before, the speed is slower, significantly slower than RAID 0. So the idea with RAID 1 is that you have 1 drive, and then all of the other drives are mirroring that 1 drive. So if you have 10 hard drives, you have 1 drive that is a master, and then all the other ones are just mirroring whatever is on that 1 drive. So if you have In this case, you have 3 disks that are 500 gigabytes apiece. Because they're all just mirrored, you have a total capacity of 500 gigabytes. As I said, the capacity is equal to that of a single drive. And then lastly, we have probably the most balanced and probably best option, which is RAID 5. And RAID 5 is faster than RAID 1, but it's slower than RAID 0. But because the data is distributed among the drives, there's much more redundancy. So the idea is with RAID 5 that instead of all of the data being on one drive and then being mirrored on other drives, you've got the data spread throughout everywhere. And basically, if one of those drives dies, you can actually rebuild that drive using the other drives. The only catch is that RAID 5 requires at least 3 disks. So with RAID 5, let's say that you have a drive, or you have a RAID that has 5 drives in it. If one of those drives goes bad, then you're fine. You just get a new drive and you put it in there. If you had that same RAID in a RAID 0 configuration, which would be faster, if any of those drives dies, then you've lost everything. So RAID 0 is definitely the one that is the most potentially problematic. RAID 1 is the safest option, and RAID 5 is sort of the most balanced option. And RAID 5 is actually, because it's so well balanced and generally works so well, it's actually used as the basis for many high-end storage systems like Avid's Isis or Nexus. So let's take a look at those. So when we're talking about shared storage, there's a question, would your choice in RAID be based on cost rather than use? I'm not sure that I understand what that question means. George, can you clarify? There's another question that says, can you use a RAID 0 and make a backup to the drives on an external hard drive? Yeah, you can absolutely do that. But you would do that outside of the RAID. So you'd have to do that with some either third-party utility or you'd have to do it manually. But yes, you can use a RAID 0 and then you could theoretically have another RAID, let's say a RAID 0, that you're backing up the first one with. But that gets kind of clunky. So George is clarifying his answer. So you would choose a type of RAID depending on your own budget rather than for a practical use, or would a certain RAID be good for a certain situation? So I would say as far as types of RAID, I would say unless you're feeling very adventurous, I would recommend not using RAID 0 and using RAID 5. Because if something fails, then you've lost everything. As far as cost, I think cost would be more like what type of RAID to buy, like what configuration, sorry, not configuration, like how many drives. But I would say I would try to go with RAID 5 in general. Try to stay away from RAID 0 unless you really know what you're doing or you have another backup of it. And the last question is the speed of RAID 0 and 5 limited by the cable used to connect to the computer? Absolutely. So if you have, let's say that you have a 5-drive RAID and they're all fairly fast drives. Let's say the aggregate speed of all of the drives is like, let's say 700 megabytes per second. If you have only a USB port on that RAID, then, or USB 3, and USB 3 is only capable of about 500 megabytes per second, that means that you are going to get slower speeds because your cable isn't as fast as your drives. All right, so let's, is there a brand I recommend? In general, I know this is kind of cliche, but I've had the best experiences with G-Tech. LaCie is good as well. And technically, if you're on a budget, you can go with something cheaper. When we're talking about hard drives, the most important thing is the RPM, which is going to tell you the speed. But you also want to take into consideration, basically the biggest thing with the brand is reliability. So if you get a better brand, you're going to get a more reliable hard drive. It's not necessarily going to be faster. It could be, but not necessarily. And then last question, should RAID be considered distinct from standard data backup? Aaron, I'm not sure that I understand the question. If you could clarify, that would be good. I'm going to go back and continue talking about shared storage. Okay, so ISIS and Nexus and TeraBlock shared storage normally connect via Ethernet. So if you're dealing with a Nexus or a TeraBlock, you're normally dealing with a single cable connection, which means that you're limited to speeds of about 100 megabytes per second, because Ethernet, at least gigabit Ethernet, is limited to 100 megabytes per second. A second cable on a Nexus could actually push you up to about 160 megabytes per second, but that's still pretty slow considering what even a single hard drive is capable of producing in terms of speed. So if you're on a network connection and you're using gigabit Ethernet, that could very easily be a bottleneck for you. 10 gigabit can be added for speeds up to probably about 450 megabytes per second per chassis, which gets a little more complicated because that's more on the network admin side. But you can have each chassis is basically just a computer that has a bunch of drives in it. But the more chassis you have, the faster speed you're going to get, because that means you have more drives. And in general, fiber connections can provide even faster speeds if your storage supports it. And then also in shared storage, we have what's called a NAS. And a NAS is a hard drive or a RAID that can be shared across a network. It provides the same speed as a RAID, but to multiple systems simultaneously. But because it usually connects via Ethernet, your speed connecting to that NAS is usually limited by that Ethernet connection to about 100 megabytes a second. So if you have a NAS or let's say that you have a RAID that you're connecting to via Ethernet, even if the RAID can produce speeds of up to, let's say, 700 megabytes a second, if you're connected to it via Ethernet, you're never going to see that 700 megabyte per second transfer speed because your connection's too slow. You're going to get about 100, maybe a little over 100 megabytes a second. So keep that in mind. All right, so this is actually directly related to what I was just saying. So we've talked about all of these connections, we've talked about speeds, but it's important to understand the effective throughput when you're dealing with all of these different things together. So for example, there is a misconception that faster transfer speeds faster connections are always better. So for example, people think that Thunderbolt is always better than USB because on paper it has a faster connection speed. But let's say that we have a Thunderbolt 1 port on the back of a RAID, right? So that RAID has a bunch of drives in it. And those drives are fairly fast, right? So with Thunderbolt, we could get from that RAID probably about a gigabit per second, or a gigabyte per second, which is about 1,000 megabytes per second. But if we take that same Thunderbolt port and we put it on the back of a portable hard drive, it's not suddenly going to become faster. The portable hard drive in this case is the bottleneck. So even though we're connecting to it via Thunderbolt, which is really fast, it doesn't matter because the hard drive is too slow to take advantage of that speed. So the hard drive will produce at max, and this is generous, 150 megabytes per second, which is probably exactly the same speed that you would get from the USB port, or from the USB port on the hard drive, because once again, the hard drive is slower than the connection on it. So basically, the thing to understand here is that no matter what your connection is, if your drive is the bottleneck, it doesn't matter. If you have a USB port, if you have a Thunderbolt port, if you have Thunderbolt 3, if the drive is too slow to even saturate a slower connection, like let's say that you have a drive with Thunderbolt 3 on it. Let's say it's a RAID. I showed one earlier that was a 2-drive RAID with Thunderbolt 3 on it. That 2-drive RAID is going to be no faster than a 2-drive RAID with Thunderbolt 2 on it, because the drive can't even saturate Thunderbolt 2. So you're really not gaining anything from this faster connection because the drive is too slow to saturate the connection to begin with. All right, so we've been talking about transfer speed and connectors, but what about the video bitrate itself? So how do we figure out if we're dealing with video, what kind of drive we're going to need? So the amount of data, or sorry, video bitrate, which is what you really want to consider when looking at drives and what you need, is the amount of data required per second to play back a video. And the bitrate directly correlates to the video quality and the file size. So for example, if you have a high bitrate video, let's say something like, and if you've seen the other presentations I've done, this is actually kind of a stolen slide, but that's neither here nor there. So if you have a high bitrate, let's say 10 megabits per second, you're going to get a high quality picture, something like this. If you have a low bitrate, you're going to have a much lower quality picture. And in general, larger resolutions and higher frame rates require higher bit rates. So the numbers that I'm referring to here, these bitrate numbers, are actually exactly the same numbers that we've been talking about with file transfers. So if we do the math on that, let's say we're talking about DNX HD. On this chart here, you'll see the type of DNX codec on the left, and then on the right, you'll see the format. In the middle, you'll see the amount or the transfer speed required to play back that codec. So for example, DNX 220 at 1080i 5994 or 720p 5994 requires 27.5 megabytes per second to play back. So if we look at an Ethernet connection, Ethernet is effectively 100 megabytes per second. So hypothetically, we could get up to 4 streams of DNX 220 running simultaneously. That might be a tight fit because DNX 220 is 27.5 megabytes per second, and we're talking about 100, so that'd be slightly over the 100 megabytes per second that the Ethernet gives us. But basically what I'm saying here is that the DNX 220 connection requires 27.5. So to get 4 streams of that, you would multiply that 27.5 by 4, and that is the speed that you're going to need to play back that footage. So what about if we have, let's say, that RAID that we were talking about earlier? So that RAID has a max speed of about 1,000 megabytes per second, 1050 megabytes per second. So if we're talking about that same DNX 220 footage, we could get hypothetically up to 40 streams of DNX 220 playing back simultaneously over that connection. So that's a lot. So that's pretty fast. So let's look at ProRes. So with ProRes, if we are using Ethernet, we could get, if we're talking about ProRes HQ at 1080i 60, which you'll see towards the bottom, you'll see that ProRes HQ at 1080i 60, just like DNX 220, requires 220 megabits per second, which is, does it tell me megabytes per second? That's about 22, approximately 22 megabytes per second. So once again, you could get hypothetically up to 4 streams of ProRes 422 HQ, 1080i 60 running simultaneously. And the math behind that was, if you look over here on the chart, you'll see that ProRes 422 HQ running at 1920 by 1080 60i requires 220 megabits per second, which is about 22 megabytes per second, and 22 goes into 100 approximately 4 times. So that's why it's approximately 4 streams. With a RAID, the same thing goes. It's about 40 streams of 422 HQ running simultaneously. So there's a question, what do I mean by running simultaneously? What I mean is playing back at the same time. So if you're on a project where you have multiple cameras, each of those cameras, if they're DNX 220, is requiring the full bandwidth of DNX 220 to play back. So if you have let's say you have a 5 camera shoot and all of your cameras are DNX 220, then you won't be able to play back all of your cameras over Ethernet without dropping frames, because each of those connections needs approximately 25 megabytes per second, which means that you need 125 megabytes per second to get your full playback of those 5 streams, which you don't have. All right, next we have DNX-HR. So with DNX-HR, if let's say we have a single stream of UHD DNX-HR HQ, let's take a look at DNX-HR HQ, a single stream at, I didn't specify what the frame rate is here, but let's say that you're doing 2997. Your transfer speed required to play back a single stream of HQX DNX-HR or DNX-HR HQ is just over 100 megabytes per second, which means that you can only get a single stream of DNX-HR playing back over Ethernet, because Ethernet is about 100 megabytes per second. However, if you're playing back off a RAID, you could get hypothetically up to 12 streams of UHD DNX-HR HQ playing back. Okay, so lastly, I was going up in terms of codecs, going with higher quality codecs. Now let's take a look at a lower quality codec. So these are standard def codecs. These are still, I think, used on reality shows. At least they were last time I worked in reality. But let's say that you have a show with like 30 cameras. You're gonna have to look at something like a standard def codec. Let's say you're looking at 10:1, which is the compression ratio. So 10:1 is the third one from the bottom. 10 to 1 requires only 3 megabytes per second to play back, which means that with video transcoded at 10 to 1, you could actually get, hypothetically, up to 33 streams of video playing back over Ethernet. So that's pretty good. So that basically means that if you have a ton of cameras and you're limited to an Ethernet connection, you're going to have to go with a very low quality codec. If you're dealing with a RAID, that's 330 streams of 10 to 1. So there's no reason that you need to use 10 to 1 if you have a connection that's that fast. All right, so there's one question here. Do you think the new cheese graters will be as successful as the old ones from, oh, that's kind of a random question. I think successful is a nebulous term. I'm actually, it's sort of a big topic, but I don't know. I think that I think they're much more what the industry needed than the so-called trash cans were. But I also think that the introductory price is definitely prohibitive for a lot of people, much more so than the old machines were. That being said, from what I've heard, the new Mac Pros are very good machines. So it's sort of, we'll have to see how things play out. Okay. So another thing to consider is not only how many cameras do you have, but also effects. So for example, do you have layers of unrendered effects in your sequence? Because each of those layers requires the same bandwidth as a full video stream. So for example, if you're in Avid and you have, what is this, like 5 or 4 layers of unrendered video on top of your footage, each of those layers of unrendered video is going to require the full bandwidth of whatever codec they're in. So let's say that you imported those graphics at DNX 220, you're going to have 5 streams of DNX 220 to play back because all of them are playing back at the same time. If you were to render, what rendering does is it actually creates, it makes effectively a mix down of all of those layers so that instead of playing back 5 streams of DNX 220, you're playing back 1 stream of DNX 220 that's already been rendered by the computer. So keep in mind that layers of unrendered effects require the same bandwidth as a full video stream. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that you have options. If you're working in Avid, you have options for increasing or, well, really for decreasing the amount of bandwidth required to play back your timeline. And that is through the video quality menu in Avid. So with a lower video quality, you're requiring less bandwidth. So if you've ever seen the video quality menu in Avid, it looks like this. It's in the lower left-hand corner of the timeline. And there are 4 options. The first one is 10-bit video quality. Next is full video quality, which is 8-bit at full quality. Then we have quarter video quality and 16th video quality. So what does this look like if we're talking about actual playback? So let's say that we have DNX 220 footage that we're trying to play back. So at full quality, DNX 220 is going to require 28 megabytes per second. And that's true of 10-bit and regular full video quality. If we drop that down to quarter video quality, that means that we are now only needing 7 megabytes per second to play back our timeline for each stream of DNX 220. If we then drop that down to 16th, we're now requiring only 2 megabytes per second. So that means that even if we didn't transcode to a really low quality codec, if we drop that video quality menu down significantly, that will allow us to play back our timeline, even if it has high quality footage in it. All right. Next, we have things to consider. All right, so the first thing that, actually the most important thing to consider is the amount of bandwidth that you need. And the considerations that you want to make are, number one, how many streams do you have running simultaneously, including graphics layers? So if you have 4 layers of graphics and 1 layer of video and you haven't rendered, that means you have 5 layers, or 5 streams that are going to play back simultaneously. If you are working on a show that is multicam and you shot 10 different cameras and you need to see all of them simultaneously, that means that you are going to require 10 streams of video playing back simultaneously. Then you want to consider how many megabits per second per stream. So if you have DNX220, it's going to be a far higher number of megabits per second versus if you're working with, let's say, DNX36. You also want to consider what is your playback quality. So if you're at full quality, it's going to take a lot more speed from the drive than if you were at, let's say, quarter or 16th quality. So what are the potential bottlenecks? So the bottlenecks are, number one is your drive speed. So if you're on, let's say, a portable hard drive, that's going to be much slower than if you were on an SSD. Next is your drive port. So let's say that your portable hard drive has a USB port, but the USB port on the drive is only USB 2. That's going to be a problem because the drive is actually faster than the port. Or let's say that you have a really fast SSD, but your computer only has USB 3. So the drive can actually be faster, but the connection to the computer is too slow to allow it to run at full speed. The other thing you want to consider is the cable. So let's say your computer has USB 3 and your drive has USB 3, but you only have a USB 2 cable. That means that you're going to be limited by that cable to only being able to use USB 2 speeds. And then you want to consider the computer port and bus. So if you have an older MacBook Pro that has, let's say it only has USB 2, that's going to significantly slow you down if you're trying to connect to anything modern. Like I was talking about the older Tower Mac Pros. Or if you are plugging multiple drives into the same bus and they're all running at high speed, then the bus is actually going to slow down the transfer speed for the drives because it can't handle the speed of all those drives. So as a general rule, if you're transferring between 2 drives, try to connect the 2 drives to the computer using different connections. So connect 1 drive over USB and 1 drive over Thunderbolt, because then you don't have to worry about how many bus or how many, whether they're on the same bus. Because if you were to, even if Thunderbolt is theoretically faster, if you connect 2 drives to the computer over Thunderbolt, but they're on the same Thunderbolt bus, it's actually going to be slower because that Thunderbolt bus speed is going to be cut in half. All right, next. Last one we have, and this is something that you don't generally have to worry about on Macs, but you do definitely have to worry about on Windows, and that's drivers. So on Windows, for example, if you purchase a card that you put into your computer that gives you USB ports, let's say it's USB-C, the computer might not natively be able to understand that those ports can be, can run at USB 10 gigabit speeds. You may have to install drivers that will tell the computer that those ports can run faster. So those are your potential bottlenecks. So how would you check your connections to make sure that you're getting the fastest possible speed? So the first thing you can do is you can check your transfer speed in Activity Monitor or in the file transfer window. So on a Mac, if you open up Activity Monitor and you go to Disk, you'll notice in the lower right-hand corner, you have a little thing here that says data written per second. So technically, that's not 100% accurate to the speed that your drive is transferring, because it also includes any other data transfer that's going on your computer. But it is, on a Mac, the most accurate way to see how fast something is transferring. That's a good way to see if you plug in a drive and you transfer a file, that's a good way to tell how fast that file is transferring. On Windows, it's much more straightforward. All you have to do is open up the More Details window. This is on Windows 7, but it's the same thing on Windows 10. And it'll actually tell you the speed that the drive is transferring. So for example, on this drive, it's transferring at 85 megabytes per second, as you can see here. The other thing you can do is you can check the connection type with system information on your Mac. So for example, if you have an older Mac and you don't know, let's say if you have USB 2 or USB 3, you can actually open up your system information window. And if you go down to USB, it will actually tell you in this area right here what the speed of the connection of that port is. So here it says up to 5 gigabits per second. That means it's a USB 3 connection. Whereas if I pull up something that is only limited to USB 2, you'll see it actually says USB 2 bus, and I think the previous one said USB 3 bus. Yeah, so this one says USB 3 bus. This one says USB 2 bus, and you'll see here it's limited to 480 megabits per second because that's the speed of USB 2. And then lastly, you can test a drive speed. This is probably the most straightforward and the most accurate way to find out how fast a drive is. You can actually test a drive speed using Blackmagic's Disk Speed Test, which is a free program that you can download for any computer, PC or Mac. And all you have to do is direct it to that drive and then hit start, and it will tell you the read and write speed that it's getting on the drive. So even if you're unsure how fast something is, or let's say you have 2 options and you don't know which one's going to give you faster performance, you can use Disk Speed Test to tell you which one is giving you faster performance. All right, next we have drive formats. So drive formats are mostly split up between operating systems. So on Mac OS, the format that most drives that are used on Macs, even at this point, at least when we're talking about external drives, most Macs still use what's called Mac OS Extended or HFS Plus. And HFS Plus can be read from and written to on Mac OS, but there's no access to it on Windows without third-party software. An example of third-party software is something like Mac Drive. So in order to read a drive that's formatted for a Mac on Windows, you would have to use third-party software because Windows can't natively read that drive. Windows default format is called Windows NTFS. And NTFS can actually be read from and written to on Windows, but it can also be read from on Mac or on a Mac, but it can't be written to on Mac OS without third-party software. And the same companies that make the software that allow you to write to Windows, or that allow you to write to Mac drives on Windows, do the same for Windows drives on Macs. Next, we have FAT32, and FAT32 is at this point, it's unfortunate that it's still a format. It's used for most flash drives and cameras, but the thing that really sucks about FAT32 is that it has a 4 gigabyte limit for a single file. So If you, let's say that you are, you're transferring something on a drive and you have a video that you need to transfer that's 6 gigs. If you plug in a flash drive, even if the drive is, let's say, 128 gigs, if the drive is formatted FAT32, it's going to tell you that the file won't fit. And the reason for that is that the file is more than 4 gigabytes. And that's the file size limit on a FAT32 drive. And all of these formats are, can be, a drive can be reformatted at any time. It's not like you buy an NTFS drive for Windows and you have to get rid of it because it won't run on a Mac. That's not the case. You can reformat it at any time, and I'll talk about that in a second. The other format that can be used, and actually FAT32 is useful because it can be read from and written to on both Mac OS and Windows. But there's another option that doesn't have that 4 gigabyte limit, which is called exFAT. And exFAT can be read from and written to on both Windows and Mac OS. And there's no file size limit, but overall, it's a less reliable format. So for example, if you're using if you have something and you're backing up to a drive, I would not recommend having exFAT as your backup format. It is far less reliable than NTFS or Mac OS. But if you're, let's say that you have a transfer drive and you're giving somebody files, exFAT is totally fine because you know that anything on that drive could be erased at any time and it wouldn't be a problem. So I would say only use exFAT for transfer drives and don't ever use FAT32 if you can avoid it. Lastly, we have APFS. So APFS is one you may have never heard of. It's actually the replacement for Mac OS Extended or HFS Plus. And it can be read from and written to on Mac OS 10.12, which is Sierra or later. And as with everything else, it is not supported at all on Windows without third-party software. And a lot of the third-party software that supports Mac OS Extended or HFS Plus doesn't yet support APFS because it's so new. It only came out like 4 years ago, maybe even less. There's a question, what causes exFAT to be so unstable? That's a good question that I don't really know. I mean, what I think what it is that it's not native to either operating system. And so the way, what makes drives stable or unstable usually is caching, which is basically does the computer try to read the drive even when there's nothing going on? Like, is there a handshake between the computer and the drive? And exFAT doesn't do much caching, I believe, which means that, for example, if you have a drive mounted, even if you're not really using it, if you don't unmount it and you pull it, if it's exFAT formatted, there's a good chance that, well, in my experience, there's a good chance that it will corrupt the drive. And I'm not an expert, I'm not an engineer, I'm not a drive engineer, but I believe that has to do with caching. So how do you format a drive? On a Mac, you would use disk utility. On Windows, you use disk management. That's, there's not much more to it. Basically, you can take any drive and format it any way you want. It doesn't really matter. You just want to consider what you're going to be using it for and then format it appropriately. All right, next we have drive mounting, and I think we're almost done. I've got like 4 more slides. So on Mac OS, you can mount an unlimited number of drives, whereas on Windows, you're limited to 26 drives at a time because each drive has to have a unique drive letter. And the last thing is something that very few people know, but there are actually, when you're talking about file size calculations, there are actually 2 ways of measuring file size. the first one is, okay, so there was actually a question, what exactly is journaling? I'm going to have to defer to the internet for that one. I mean, I'm familiar with the fact that Mac OS Extended Journal is the standard format for Macs, but I can't say for sure what journaled versus unjournaled means, but it's really easy to find online. I know I've looked it up before and I just don't remember. All right, so file size calculations. There are two ways of measuring file size. The first one is base 10, and in base 10, a 1 gigabyte equals 1,000 megabytes. The other one is base 2, or binary, and in that, 1 gigabyte equals 1024 megabytes. In general, hard drive sizes are usually measured in base 10. Now, this becomes really frustrating because between Mac OS and Windows, the two operating systems actually calculate file size differently. So on a Mac, everything is calculated base 10. So if you see that something is 2.41 gigabytes, that means it's 2,410 megabytes. Whereas on Windows, everything is measured in base 2. So if you see that something is 1 gigabyte, it's actually 1024 megabytes. But what's really annoying about Windows is that for some reason, Windows insists on measuring all files in kilobytes. So you'll notice that no matter how big a file is, Windows does not adjust the measurement. It just lists it in kilobytes. So for example, on the left, you'll see on a Mac, you have 2.2 megabytes followed by 2.41 gigabytes. On Windows, you have 2,000 kilobytes followed by 2 million kilobytes. In my opinion, very annoying and very frustrating, and I don't understand why they do it. But yeah, the point is that Windows measures things base 2, Mac OS measures things base 10. So you'll notice that the numbers definitely do not line up, and that's the reason why. Okay, so I'll take questions in just a second. I'm just going to do a quick summary, which is number one, when you're dealing with this stuff, it's important to be mindful of compatibility, bottlenecks, and OS limitations. So you want to make sure that if you have a drive that's fast, you want to make sure that your connection's fast. If you have a computer with a fast connection, you want to make sure that your drive is taking advantage of that. If you have let's say that you have a card that's capable of faster USB speeds that you put into your computer, you want to make sure that your OS supports that card, and that you also want to make sure that you've installed, as I mentioned before, you've installed the proper drivers, although that's less of a concern on a Mac. You also want to make sure you're using codecs and bit rates that match your storage. So if you are on Ethernet, keep in mind that you're limited to about 100 megabytes per second. So if you've got 4K footage that requires, let's say, 120 megabytes per second just to play back a single stream, Ethernet's not going to do you very much good. Whereas if you have, if you're playing something back in HD and you're using a low bit rate codec like DNX36, you're going to be able to play things back just fine. That won't be a problem. In fact, DNX36 is so slow, or actually so low quality, that you could actually play back a single stream of DNX36 over USB 2, because USB 2 is actually 48 megabytes per second. DNX36 is only 36 megabytes per second. Actually, it's even lower than that. DNX36 is about 8 megabytes per second, because 36 is the number of megabits. Anyway, just keep in mind that you want to make sure that you're using codecs that match the storage that you have. So you want to figure out which one's more important, the codec that you're using or the capabilities of your storage in your system. And then you want to make the other one match. So if you have a really beefy system, you can use a really beefy codec. If you have, if you need to use, if you have a lower end system, you want to make sure that your codec isn't going to tax your system in a way that it can't handle. And lastly, the biggest takeaway, well, this isn't something I've emphasized in this presentation, but the best way to figure this stuff out is basically just to test everything. So if you get a new drive and you're concerned that it might not be fast enough, just check. Just do a speed test and you'll know if it's fast enough. Or, you know, if you need to know if the drive can support, you know, the footage that you're working with, just transcode a few files and try to plan back, and you'll know very quickly if it's going to work. All right, so that's pretty much everything for today. So I'll go ahead and answer some of these questions. And then if anybody has any other questions, go ahead and throw those up in the Q&A. So the first one is, what professional facilities that serve entire shows are using for internet connections, drive transfer rates, and connection speeds? So when you're talking about shows in the industry, most shows work with what's called an offline workflow, which basically means that they work with lower quality footage, things like DNX36, which means that you can have, with an offline workflow, you can have pretty slow connections and you'll still be able to get by no problem. So with DNX36, for example, it's, I guess technically it's like it's got to be like 8 megabytes per second. No. Anyway, DNX36 is a very low number of megabytes per second. So you can view many streams of DNX36 over an Ethernet connection. So by far, Ethernet is the fastest way to, the most common way to connect to shared storage in the industry. Drive transfer rates are a different story, but it depends on, you know, does your drive need to be fast? If the drive is coming in the morning and the editor needs it ready within like an hour, yeah, you need a fast drive. But if the drive is coming in and transferring overnight, do you really need it to be that fast? I mean, it might be good because then you could, you know, if there are any problems, you could figure that out and then fix it and then start the transfer over again. But it's not really required. Next question is, should RAID be considered distinct from standard data backup? And the clarification was, should it be expected to have an additional separate backup drive for a RAID 1, or would this be overkill? I would say if you're using RAID 0, you should 150% have a backup. If you're using RAID 5, I don't necessarily think that you need a backup on top of that, but it's not a bad idea. I mean, if you're talking about a big project with lots of footage that a ton of money was spent to shoot, you know, what's another $1,000 for a drive? Whereas if you're talking about a small project that's just a personal thing, as long as you're not using RAID 0, then if you if you lose the footage, it would be really hard for you, but you wouldn't get fired, and you know, life goes on. Answered that one. Question about outboard SSDs. Trade-off in reliability with external SSDs. I'd say the only trade-off is the potential for problems if the the question basically is, if you have an SSD which is a you know, like a faster hard drive effectively, plugged into your computer, is that more or less reliable? I wouldn't say that there's any difference in reliability unless the drive were to somehow become disconnected, which would never happen if it were internal, but could happen if it's external. Let's say that, you know, you've got it on a table and somebody walks by and accidentally tugs the cable and then it comes out of the computer. That's definitely less reliable. But if you're safe and you're reasonable about what you're doing with the SSD, I wouldn't say that there's any difference in reliability. Next question is, isn't the internet really the deciding factor now in what codec to use, since connection speeds for sharing are below 60 megabits per second? I suppose, I would assume that the question is implying that you're working over a network, in which case it really depends on what your up and download speeds are on your local network connection. So for example, in my apartment, I get 100 megabits up and 100 megabits up and 20 megabits, no, sorry, 100 megabits down and 20 megabits up, which means that that's about as much as an Ethernet connection could do. No, that's megabits. I'm sorry. I don't want to confuse you there. 100 megabits is about 10 megabytes, whereas a gigabit, which is what an Ethernet cable is capable of, is about 100 megabytes. So that means that technically my 100 megabit Ethernet at home can transfer about 10 megabytes per second, which is really slow. But if we're working with the outside network, the outside world, then that's generally fast enough. Last question is, Avid keeps crashing when trying to export multiple VFX on my timeline. Could there be a problem with bandwidth? No. Exports have almost nothing to do with transfer speed. You're only going to be dealing with transfers. Well, okay, that's not true. An export will go much faster when you have a faster transfer speed, but the reliability of an export doesn't have anything to do with the transfer speed. If an export is unreliable, and this actually doesn't really have to do with file transfers and stuff like that, but I'm answering the question with information that we actually have in another class that I may do. But usually if Avid is crashing trying to export anything, it's a problem with the media. Either the media needs to be rendered or something else. But no, that would not be a problem with the bandwidth or the connection speed to your hard drive. All right, does anybody have any last questions? Please feel free to ask anything else. And I'll switch over to nothing else. Nobody? Okay. All right. Thank you guys very much. And if you do have any follow-up questions, feel free to email me, assistbootcamp@gmail.com. If you guys have time, go check out our website, assistbootcamp.com, and check out some of the classes that we offer. None of them are in person right now because of COVID, but we've got the reality class for free, which is amazing considering what you're getting. And then the other class is for 50 bucks, which is like nothing for the amount of material. It's like 5 hours worth of material. So thank you guys so much. Enjoy the rest of your day, and I hope this was helpful. And we're actually going to send out a a survey later today. If you guys could just fill that out and let us know how you enjoyed the class, we'd very much appreciate it. There's one last question, which is used to record to a NAS from a TriCaster, which caused footage to end up being staggered and lost frame rates in the edit. Would the low bandwidth have caused this? Yeah, that's very possible. If you're doing a live recording, then the bandwidth has to be high enough to be able to play back the footage or record the footage in real time. So if you've got footage that is recording at, let's say, 40 megabits per second, but it's trying to write back to a drive that is only capable of writing 20 megabits per second, you're going to get drop frames because there's not enough bandwidth there to feed the image, basically. Okay, cool. Thank you guys very much. As I said before, feel free to email us. Otherwise, I'll talk to you guys later. Thanks.